All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're digging into a really provocative article by a writer who goes by the Appalachian Gorilla. And they make this bold claim that our biggest conflicts, well, they're not really about philosophy at all. They're about resources. So if you're ready to see politics in a completely new light, let's get into it. We all know this story, right? It's the classic narrative you see pretty much everywhere. You've got the left, painted as this kind of socialist monster trying to upend the whole system. And then you've got the right, the supposed defenders of capitalism and freedom. It's always presented as this huge, epic battle of ideas. But this is where our source material just completely flips that whole narrative on its head. The author argues we're not fighting over ideals. We're fighting over tangible stuff. We're fighting over resources and power. And let me tell you, that one shift in perspective, it changes absolutely everything. So, okay, if it's not some grand philosophical battle, what is it then? Well, according to this piece, both the left and the right are actually fighting for the exact same thing. They're fighting to continue a system that just needs constant fuel to survive. They're just playing different roles to keep the whole thing from falling apart. And here's where the argument gets really, really interesting. The author says the progressive left aren't socialists. No, they're the managerial class, and their job is to create a compliant workforce. The right, on the other hand, they're the consumers. They want all the benefits of globalism, cheap stuff, but without any of the national responsibilities that come with it. The most important point, though, is that both sides are totally locked into sustaining this system that's just eating itself to survive. So how on earth did we get here? The root of the problem, according to the source, is a system that is absolutely addicted to endless growth. But, eventually that system started running out of easy fuel. It ran out of low-hanging fruit, so it had to look somewhere else. And this just perfectly lays out the chain reaction. This desperate need for growth led to outsourcing for cheap labor, and that meant moving production over to places like China. Now, all of this was made possible by the petrodollar system, which kept oil prices low enough to make global shipping super cheap. But what was the cost? Well, the system, in the author's words, had to sacrifice its own workers to get that global growth. So this global expansion, it eventually hit its own limits too. And the consequences of that, combined with the 2008 financial crisis, created this massive tidal wave of money that had to find a return somewhere. But the question was, where? Now, here's a pretty staggering claim from the article. The author alleges that a full third of the money supply was printed after 2008. But get this, it wasn't to bail out the banks. It was to save the retirement funds of the baby boomer generation. This just created this enormous ocean of cash that was desperate to find a place to grow. And this is really the key question, isn't it? When you flood the world with that much capital, but there are no new frontiers to expand into, what happens to all that money? Well, it gets creative. And according to the author, it gets really destructive. It flowed right into what the author calls vulture capital. And this model isn't about building anything new. It's about acquiring a business, stripping out all its value, replacing skilled workers, automating jobs, extracting every single last penny of profit, and then just selling the empty shell. It's a purely extractive, hollow out and move on kind of process. So after exhausting businesses, this capital turned on the last untapped resource it could find, the people of Western nations themselves. And this showed up as data mining, addictive technologies designed to extract our money, and, as the author puts it, using mass immigration as a tool to push down wages for the working class. So what was the result of all this economic pressure? Well, it wasn't unity, that's for sure. It created these deep, deep social fractures. The system essentially created two completely different realities for two different groups of people, and then it pitted them against each other. And this slide just illustrates those two realities so powerfully, using the example of immigration. For the working class, it's direct, head-to-head competition for jobs and wages. But for the college-educated class, often working from home, the interaction is completely different. It's mostly as a consumer of services, like food delivery. It's the same issue, but experienced in two totally separate worlds. So, where does that leave us? What's the author's final diagnosis? It's pretty stark. We've basically hit a wall. We have reached the absolute physical limits of our system of endless growth. And to really drive this point home, the article offers this great thought experiment. Imagine if we priced oil not just for today's consumption, but to make it last for 1,000 years. What would happen? Well, the price would skyrocket to something crazy, like $1,000 a barrel. Economic growth would basically slow to a crawl, and our entire way of life would have to change, fundamentally. And what would those changes even look like? Well, according to the author, a world with limited resources would mean slower growth, yeah, but human labor would become way more valuable. Family and community bonds, they'd become essential again, not just optional. And you couldn't just escape your social problems by moving to a new suburb. You'd actually have to stick around and solve them. And this brings us to the author's big idea, peak modernity. It's basically the moment the magic runs out. It's the point where we can't just throw cheap energy or print more money to solve our problems. We are finally being forced to deal with the real physical world and all of its limits. So, the crucial point is this. The author says we can no longer just paper over our atomization, our social disconnectedness. The era of just endlessly kicking the can down the road, of moving away from our problems, it's over. We have finally hit the boundary. And that leaves us with one last, really challenging question. If the author is right, if our deepest conflicts are really about physical limits, about resources and energy and power, then all these philosophical debates aren't the answer. So, what kind of real, tangible, physical solutions would we actually need to build instead?